and good afternoon to everybody who is joining in. My name is, again, Nelson Santini. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer of BSI. And today we're going to be talking about written passwords in advanced MFA. So we're going to have a good dialogue. I hope that this presentation is fruitful for everybody as we move on forward and go through the presentation. If you have any questions, please, by all means, just raise your hand. We can actually have a dialogue. I'll try to move through the slides briskly, and then at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Today's webinar, it is actually sponsored by Biometrics Signature ID, and our goal is to protect your most valuable digital assets. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the products, but right now I want to move into the presentation itself and just to talk about MFA and what it's the purpose and how we can make it better through alternatives, in the methodology. So let's get started. And so the purpose of MFA is actually fairly straightforward. And it was actually just implemented so that we could protect actually digital assets. And so this is from the perspective of corporations or individuals. So there's MFA that it's helping us as consumers protect our digital information. And there's also MFA that at the corporate level is actually just helping to protect the assets of corporations, right? And this is all under the premise that while we actually live in the real world, so everybody is IRL, everything that we're doing, most of our transactions and everything that we're doing happens in the digital world. And so we're migrating to the digital world, where everything that we do is on those transactions is digital form. So we have to protect that information. And the challenge that we're experiencing right now is that corporations and also us, the consumers, we're losing billions of dollars on a yearly basis based on cost and losses that we're experiencing. And this happens through the fact that people are sharing credentials. Credentials are being stolen. Credentials are being replicated. And so this is something that you see in the news constantly, and it's a problem that we can address and we could actually just can remedy, with some technology that's available today. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude and just to kind of like ground this element into the truth, right, into what's going on around us, you can just go online and just see these elements of impact, right? So I have a couple of articles in here. You can see one of the elements, right? Video providers losing $9.1 billion in revenues, right? It's a pretty substantial number, no matter where you want to come from, right? That is actually just a juicy loss, that people are actually just undergoing. So very important, very substantial. If you're looking at breaches in data from PayPal, breaches in data from other corporations, just yesterday, AT&T, right? Millions of dollars in losses to prevent those from happening again, millions of dollars in loss through remediation, loss of the trust, customers leaving. It's a pretty big problem, right? So I just want to put that into the context of MFA. It was designed to protect those digital assets. And right now, the truth is, it's got some challenges. So let's go ahead and set the table and set the stage for the conversation, right? All of this is predicated under the fact that MFA has been, placed as in the light of the law of the land, if you will. Right? And so there was an executive order that was passed last year through the White House, OMB, and basically states, hey, you all have to move into a zero trust environment. You all actually have to operate, assuming that there are going to be dangers in exchanging digital information. And that's where the industry, in general is going. And through different standards, whether it's the NIST or others, we're implementing all of these elements of security. Some people, prefer to MFA, some people prefer MFA, but in general, we're all moving to this zero trust environment. And as that it refers to MFA, what we're finding out is that it is not a complete solution, right? And the biggest challenge on what's going on is the fact that, hey, that the factors that are used to authenticate through MFA can be shared, can be stolen, can be replicated, can be compromised, right? How many times have you been in a situation where, whether we want to admit it or not, and nobody will ever see me admit this actually in a bar, saying, hey, Nelson, can I have your password, to authenticate here? Or, well, yes, or I need to get into this folder, hey, can I see? All of these things are happening, right? And so the human element is foiling the design of what MFA was supposed to be all about. And so said differently, right? Today's MFA, it's broken, right? There's just no easy way to say it. And it's not to be critical about it. It is just broken. And it's because the premise of MFA was fairly straightforward. And as humans, we're actually just going around it. The premise of MFA was that at one time, it would be really hard for one person to have multiple factors be readily available unless this person was the one intended to have access to the data, right? So said differently, it was the odds of actually somebody just coming together with all of these factors at the same time, very, very tough, for somebody to do in a timely fashion. That said, how long does it take you, I'll ask you this question, to text a code to a friend? And I mean, when just to give you a situational example of this, right? When you're looking at actually just elements like sharing an account, let's be specific. Netflix, is one of those companies where they actually just lost a total of $9 billion last year on revenues because people are just defeating the MFA. Hey, can you text me the code that you just got on your cell phone? I'm trying to watch this particular movie, right? And that's what happens, right? Let's put it from another perspective. And this is something that some of the folks who are on the phone call here can attest, right? Can your retinal scan be used without your presence? And for that matter, replace your retinal scan with, can your fingerprints be used without your being present? Could your voice be used against, without your presence, right? And the short answer is, yeah, it can be done, right? Because it's a digital file typically that's carrying the information about your fingerprints, your palm print, your facial scanning. These things happen, right? And so this is not here something that we're talking about Spectre and something about MI5 or MI6 or Mission Impossible. This is real world stuff that happens, that right now is just being weaponized by forces that are not necessarily military forces, right? This is just hackers are stealing your identity and they're trading. If you take a moment after this presentation or you're so inclined, if you want to go up to our website and take a quick look at the blog, you'll find out there that there's a couple of examples and articles that I've highlighted for you so you can see examples where the people have been trading the fingerprints of US soldiers and the likes. And so that's just an example of things that happen. So the premise that MFA is based upon then is a flawed premise, right? Because although it is unlikely, it happens that all of these factors could be shared by one person, or that malactors can basically get all of these factors at the one time that they want to authenticate. So let's take a moment and talk about what the factors are, right? And I guess that we're all familiar with these factors are. They have different names and they come in different flavors, but three major categories, right? You have knowledge, possession, and inherence, right? And so knowledge is something that I know, possession is something that I have, and inherence is something that I am. And this is actually how most folks are actually familiar with that, because that's how most instructions are written, right? And so examples of knowledge or something that I know is just your password, something that is fixed, like your name or your PIN or the particular key phrase for you to unlock and gain access and authenticate. A different factor is possession, something that you have. Sometimes it is as simple as you're looking for my little happy little phone over here. Your phone, back in the day, if you were actually just in the initial waves of multi-factor authentication, everybody remembers actually just elements like your dongle and or your authentication or your cipher, right? Your YubiKey is used today, right? And so that's an example of possession, something that you have. And quite frankly, something that you can also lose. We're going to get back into that one because if you've ever been into the field, you know that the little happy dongle that basically gives you the fancy code for you to authenticate gets lost more times than you care to admit, right? But that's a factor, possession. I'm coming to the last one, just being the inherence, right? Something that I am. And again, this is actually examples of where your biometrics come in handy. And this could be in the flavor of behavioral biometrics, or this could be in the more common one, which is physical biometrics, right? But all the same, this is something that I am. These are like the key elements of MFA. Because of the shortcomings that we're experiencing, we can see that the industry is moving into different elements where we're trying to bring in new factors into the MFA authentication. And so when you're looking at to advance opportunities and ways to fix MFA, one of them is actually just location, right? This is where I am. And so when you come down to location, this could be like geofencing. This could be where you happen to be authenticating. So take, for example, if you're coming to a controlled facility, you're going to inside of this SCIF, by virtue of being there and having a unique network, that may be one of the elements that may actually just help you to authenticate. Or, if you happen to have perhaps a device like your cell phone, and your cell phone is actually just inside of a location that is geofenced, again, you have your device and also you have your geolocation that tells you I am here. And so you're meeting that factor again. So you have multiple factors combining to authenticate. So location, one of the up and coming elements of MFA. You also have the ability. And so ability is a factor that, has different forms. It's something that I can do. So perhaps you're looking at the stride or the gait as you're walking, or, similar, factors that relate to something that you can do. Perhaps actually the way that you write your passport, perhaps the way that you actually just make a gesture, right? But ability comes into play and brings in some interesting factors that help you augment your position when it comes down to multi-factor authentication. And last but not least, in this particular group that I'm talking here is randomness. And we're seeing this one pick up a lot of speed and a lot of adoption into the marketplace and traction, right? So something that I know just in time. So for example, this is a place where you can actually just have a random code be sent to you just in time, or a factor that changes with every time that you approach, or the sequence in which you basically do your authentication. So in an example, it could be as simple as if you have a PIN, instead of actually just writing numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, just, the computer will ask you, hey, just write the numbers 3, 1, 2, 4. And the next time that rotation will take place in a different form, right? Or, enter first your password and then put your thumbprint, right? So randomness and the way that these are authenticated, changes, right? So MFA, classical factors and now newer factors that are being brought in so we can actually just make a more robust solution, right? And so we stack these together and we go back to the original premise of like, okay, things that I can share, I can steal, and I can replicate. You can begin to work on a chart over here that can tell you, okay, so which of these are actually just more suited to address these concerns? And so you can see that I'm kind of like highlighting here with X's and check marks, where do we stack? So knowledge, can I share it? Sure. Can I steal it? Mm-hmm. Can I replicate it? Absolutely. Same thing with possession, right? I can replicate these factors. I can steal those factors, or I can share them. As you get into the area of inherence, ability, and randomness, right, you begin to have a mix of them that basically tells you, okay, so some things I can do, some things I can't do. And sure, it's all into like a relative scale, because I guess with enough money and a supercomputer, you can do any of these things, right? So this is a matter of balancing the typical resources and just a reasonable approach. But you can begin to see that as you get into inherence, ability, and randomness, you actually have the X's indicating here's what is kind of hard to do, and in check marks, what is easily to protect. And the last piece is in location, can those, be shared, stolen, or replicated? Absolutely, right? So we have different factors and how we combine them. This is how we make MFA a more robust solution. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is then, okay, so how can we plug these MFA loopholes, so that we can avoid our credentials to be shared, stolen, or replicated, right? What alternative factors, or how do we use them? So let's just dig in and talk about the ones that basically had the check marks and just dig into those that are new and up and coming. The first one that you see here is actually just looking at randomness, right? And so with randomness has the pros and cons, and the list is actually just a bridge for the purpose of the presentation. But, when it comes down into the pro side, okay, so it's harder to replicate because you don't know what's going to happen until it happens, right? It's a just-in-time measurement that can be as simple as changing the order of the factors or changing a way in the order in which the factors are entered. Sometimes, you may be asked to authenticate using your mouse. Sometimes you may be asked to authenticate using your finger. Sometimes you may be authenticated or request to be authenticated using your selfie into a camera, right? All of these things bring in the randomness that the algorithm is going to say, yes, yay, verily, that is Nelson in fact, and so we're going to grant them access. And one of the pros is that you can quickly integrate this with most technologies that we have in the marketplace today. On the other side, some of these, elements require devices that can be lost, right? And that becomes a problem because if you lose the device, then you cannot authenticate. And eventually, one of the things that we've known is that when it comes down to computer-driven randomness, well, we know that they're as random as the code that was basically used to write them. So, with enough time, with enough compute power, you can just make any algorithm to a point, be somewhat predictive. So you're eating into the randomness. It's how difficult do we want to make the moat for people to go across it? So randomness, pros and cons, right? As like anything else, is one of the newer factors that is being used. When it comes down to inherence factors, right? And again, this is actually in the world of the physical side. Pros, everybody loves them, right? Reduce the friction into the process, It's no need to recall because this is who you are. So it's, you don't have to recall your fingerprints because that's who you are, right? And, again, these are just things that are easy. They're just inherent to who you are. On the con side, hey, they can be stolen. Somebody can replicate your fingerprint. Somebody can replicate, and steal the files that have your retinal scan, your facial scan, the likeness. And again, we're seeing this live as we go. One of the challenges that just happened this week was actually AT&T going through a breach, and we're looking at all of the factors coming with it, as far as all of the data and private information, PII, that was stolen. And we don't know exactly what the ramifications are, but this is an example of like physical factors that can be stolen. So on one side, super convenient. On the other side, there's going to be some trade-off, and so some certain things that have to be done to mitigate the cons, right? And just like with anything else, the same thing is true when you come into the world of the behavioral factors, right? It's more difficult for them to be stolen, more difficult for them to be replicated, right? They have built-in randomness and they're easy to learn, right? So they have those pros that make behavioral biometrics easy to adopt. But on the other end, the engine behind them sometimes requires some complex algorithms. They do inject friction into the process. And I want to make a point here. Friction, people sometimes speak about it and they say, you're introducing friction into the equation. Maybe sometimes you do want to inject some friction into the equation, depending on the kind of authentication that you're bringing forward. So to take it into the extreme, I mean, if we were to basically launch an MAO or major attack option on nuclear missiles, I definitely want some friction. That's why we have 4 people check that, when you give those orders to the nuclear triad. When it comes down to authenticating a check or a purchase of a milk carton, the local superstore, probably not, overkill, right? So there's a balance between how do I use a complex algorithm and how do I use some of the behavioral factors, and where do we use them, right? So there's all of these trade-offs between MFA, how do we make it work, the regular factors that we have, and how do we inject newer factors to inject some friction, to inject some checks and balances to make sure that we're achieving the goal, which is to protect the digital assets for a corporation or from the human. So let's talk about then what are some of the recommendations that we have, knowing all of these facts, and again, figuring out what are the remediations that we can consider. So the first one is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, and I'm sure that we all of them in here who make this our business understand that we have to act always like MFA as a protocol can be hacked. And so that's the premise. That's probably why you're here, because we all want to know, hey, how can I make my MFA protocol more robust and avoid actually just having a circumvention of it? Second element is actually just, hey, listen, randomization is a great solution into how to basically inject and resizzle some of the existing factors that are used on MFA and how you have a more robust solution. So by simple injection of randomization with the factors that you have, you can make your solution more robust. And last but not least, which is the topic of this webinar, is then how can we use biometrics, specifically the written ones, to actually just move on forward. So yes, evaluate, what type of biometrics you're using and when do you use them, because they can truly help to plug in the gaps that MFA has right now. So when do I use which, right? And so you have a little bit of an eye chart in here. This is for everybody just to read, and at your own leisure, I'll make sure that the presentation is available on the website for you to download, and you'll get a link to it. But I mean, when you look at, when do I use what? Okay, so let's just divide these and just say, okay, behavioral biometrics versus physical biometrics. And so on the physical biometrics, if you're trying to move really quickly, and if you want to basically just make sure that you can actually get a couple things, authentications done with less friction, if you have a low risk transaction, if you want to move with speed, physical biometrics, right? Convenient, if you're not concerned about losing your dongle, physical biometrics, all of these things, can be done. When you're looking at behavioral biometrics, okay, well, this is more of a higher value play where you're protecting data that has higher and perhaps inherent value, or the transaction itself is more consequential. That may be a better element of when to use behavioral biometric. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples as we move on through the presentation. But again, it's a matter of like, when do I use it? What is the trade-off between convenience and security, and what is the right call to make? So let's talk a bit about then the written or drawn password. And again, this is an alternative, and why does it basically make a good play on how to plug some of the holes in MFA? So just a quick recap, we're talking now behavioral biometrics, right? And specifically, as we said, we were going to talk about the written or drawn password. And so a couple of things, right? First thing is, this is not about calligraphy. So it really doesn't matter if you are just writing the US Constitution or if you're a Marine with a Crayola. And I know that I have a Marine over here, and I know that, he was issued a nice box of Crayolas, right? It doesn't matter if you're a calligraphist or if you're using a Crayola, is what you write and how you write it. It's nothing about how pretty it is, right? Is can you repeat it? Can you actually just do the same, signature all of those times, and does it look the same? Mathematically, it is somewhat impossible to beat or really difficult to beat. And so the reason is when you're writing something, there's a big difference in, for example, and I'll just give you an example here. There's a big difference whether you're trying to write 4 letters like PBNZ, and if you actually just happen to know what that stands for, go ahead and hit me on the chat. But let's say that you have 4 characters. There's a big difference between PBNZ and a code, which is 4 characters, or PBNZ being written, and so how do you write it? What are the order of the letters, the strokes, number of strokes that it takes for you to write it? That's an infinite combination. I can share that password with a couple of folks in here in the room, and having everybody repeat it and make it look the same number of strokes, same velocities, it's really difficult to do. So it injects a mathematical complexity that, although simple and elegant, is very robust, and again brings in the element of randomization inherently without having to do something else. So it's a random way of looking at how this comes together, right? It doesn't require training. It doesn't require just for you to learn a new skill, but what it does require is proficiency, because we're not used to this social engineering aspect. So when you're looking at the behavioral biometrics, the written or drawn password, fairly robust, easy to adopt, easy to roll out, but it's not necessarily what you do all the time, right? We don't see this broadly adopted just yet. The technology is catching up with the industry for us to see this now being rolled out, into point of sale transactions to be used in your phone. So you can basically just use your signature remotely. That's what the written passwords are bringing in. And again, as a reminder, the so what, or one of the key elements here, is that it is inherently random. And when you're looking at all of the factors that you can analyze on writing a password versus typing it, it's billions to 1 in the odds. I can basically just do a one-on-one with you if you want to on how we can calculate some of these things. And the permutations are just completely off the chart. Even for a 300 characters with 4 cells in random order, I think the numbers are like $1.90 to 192 billion to 1. And so by my count, if we only had 111 billion people walking through the earth, then, we can truly say that some written passwords are just one person and one person only. And so when you're looking at the written passwords, again, you can have the same password, written by 1 person, written by 2 persons, by 3 people, right? And again, one of the key elements where people get confused when you're talking about behavioral biometrics and specifically the written password is not just about comparing the images. It's not overlaying the images one on top of the other one. It's something that is completely different, right? This is just kind of like on the cosmetic side, what Adobe would tell you or DocSign will tell you, I'm going to overlay the signature here. It has nothing to do with that, right? When you're using written passwords, what's happening is there's an algorithm that's analyzing how you're basically building that picture. So it's more like a motion picture, like a movie. It's like a puzzle that is coming together that you can see here that basically tells you if this is what my password is, as I am writing it, I'm asking how many strokes, what's the speed, what's the sequence, what's the angle of attack, if you have the haptics, how much pressure am I using, how thick is the line that I'm using. All of these factors begin to paint a picture that makes a flat signature something that is more like a kaleidoscope of colors, right? That has a random order, it's inherent to the user, and it relies upon the ability of the person to do, right? So this is where, when you look at it as an alternative, something that is really tough to beat, that cannot be stolen, replicated, or actually just compromised, is a version of written passwords, right? And this is, again, where one of the recommendations is, try something like a tested version of behavioral biometrics, right? So the next couple of slides is basically just to talk about, biometric signature ID and one of the solutions that we bring, which is having their written password. I'll move through these like in 30 seconds, but, you can take a look at these on your own time. When you're looking at behavioral biometrics versus physical biometrics, right? This one chart kind of tells a story, which is Physical biometrics, all addressing the inherent, this is what I am. All of these things at some point or another one could be compromised in one shape or form or another. And when it comes down to it, the combination of I know or I have, you have to combine it with another factor, thus multi-factor authentication. Some solutions like BSIs happen to be all into one. So by you writing your password, you happen to meet the requirement of I am, I know, I have, and what do you know? Even the something I can do, right? So this is one of those unique elements where a written password or a password that is an image that you're drawing presents the ability to plug in some of these holes that although I can share my password with you, the odds of you being able to repeating this and doing it in the same way that I do are so high that basically stops you cold, right? You cannot share it, you cannot steal them. Whether you're a man or a machine, you cannot replicate them, right? Really tough and difficult to do. And so shameless plug in here, if you want to learn more about it, we can talk to you about, BSIs and the technology of CVL that basically gives you some technical advantages. And again, mathematically speaking, this particular version that you're looking for in here is 192 billion to 1. If I look at some of the variations that we have, we're talking into the trillions to 1 in the odds. So is this something that you would use all the time? Okay, but let's go back to the when do we want to use these transactions versus others. Everything has a time and place. But if you're trying to protect really important and critical information, this is one of those alternatives that can basically validate the case that we have, which is to say that behavioral biometrics does close the critical MFA loophole that is costing industries billions of dollars and some consumers hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So with that, I'm just looking at the clock and I'm coming into the half-hour mark. I want to make sure that I leave some time for us to discuss. But that was the case that I wanted to consider and just enter into a discussion with the rest of the folks in the audience, so we can talk about, hey, written passwords. How does that impact the holes that we have on MFA? And how is that something that can prepare us to be more robust? And so let's just talk a little bit about biometric signature ID. In the context of like what the product can do or similar products, I should say. So not talk about the brand, but these written passwords, what they can do for MFA and to help protect the digital assets that we're trying to protect. So with that, I just wanted to actually just open up the floor to questions and, comments that folks may want to make, so this is opening here for discussion. So everybody can come off mute. And do I have anybody that wants to ask a question or a comment to ask as it relates to why, written passwords are a good way to plug the holes of MFA? Around the room. So I have Mr. Martin, Dr. Bitter, Mr. Doyle, Mr. McKay, and a couple of other folks here in the room. So any takers, anybody who wants to chime in or ask a question? If not, then that's fine too. I just want to be prompt and make sure that I return you to the world of the living here within 30 minutes, which was the goal as we started. So any questions?
Hey, Nelson. Yes, this is Adam Doyle. If you could just speak to the group about how this platform operates in a with a mouse versus a touchpad, so that you can explain how that kind of nuance takes shape. Thank you.
Now, I appreciate the question. And so the question is, how does it work with a mouse versus a finger versus a stylus, which I happen to have one here as I use a tablet that has a stylus. And so when you're looking at behavioral biometrics and different tools or software solutions like ours, right, you can build multiple profiles that basically allow you to authenticate by, again, that's the 3 examples that we just said, stylus, finger, or the mouse. And so as you're basically coming in to basically build your profile, what you're doing is you're building, again, a version of you, an avatar of you that is your signature or your PIN using the mouse. And that's why it's a beautiful thing that it doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be something that you can reproduce every single time. So if you look at the application, I'm just going to go back here to the navigator and just show you an example. If you're looking at this particular slide, you can see the four slots at the bottom. This is one of those versions where you can, with your mouse, just enter in one of those rectangular areas, the number, the code, whatever it is. With your mouse, it's simple as just clicking and dragging, right? So if you have ever used Microsoft Draw, or if you ever used Apple Draw, it is that simple, right? You just drag your mouse and just write the symbol, and let us basically embrace the fact that it looks like you're writing with your weak hand. So if you're right-handed, it looks like you were trying to write something with your left hand. But the beautiful thing is that if you can reproduce it consistently, which is what we found out, then it becomes something that is unique to you. You can build a profile with each of the devices, and the devices or the profiles begin to learn as you basically just age or use more proficiently the solution. So you get to repeat yourself, the same password, the same authentication, and you become more proficient, which is one of the things that I had mentioned. The computer learns with you and basically makes it easier for you to authenticate and again, move on from that point. So again, it's very straightforward. It doesn't take any special social engineering. It's just literally using your mouse as you would use your mouse. Did I answer your question, Adam?
Yeah, perfectly. Thanks very much. I appreciate that.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Do I have any other questions from anybody else? I think that we have a room of quiet folks, and that's quite fine. It's okay. Any other questions or comments around?
Hey, Nelson, thanks so much for the presentation. Appreciate it. I did throw the blog post that you wrote, a physical versus behavioral face-off, into the chat for those that might want some more information on that. And then, if you could maybe just briefly touch on some of the industries or verticals that this solution would apply to, that would be great.
I appreciate actually just helping me out with a question there, Andrew. And so a couple of let's just not only talk about the industry, but talk about the scenario here, because this is important. So let's say, for example, that you have an industry like, let's take manufacturing. And let's say that you're basically are in a place where you have a lot of bandsaws, mills, or things like this, right? You want to make sure that you protect the machinery and the people. So the machinery, for those who don't know it, a mill could be in the hundreds of thousands, sometimes a lathe machine for complex manufacturing in the oil and gas industry, millions of dollars, right? And it's very simple for somebody to basically turn on that machine or CNC. Next thing you know, it breaks into pieces and you've lost millions of dollars on the hardware. So an example of where to use a technology like this would be in high-end complex manufacturing, where you want to protect the equipment and the user. And so you come onto a screen like your computer, you come on in and you basically literally authenticate right now with a thumbprint, which is a fingerprint scanner, right? But where you can augment with that is, hey, I'm gonna have to write my password and to get the machine going. And the reason that's important is because when you have to write your password, you have to be capable to do that. You have to be in your right mind. You cannot be drunk. You cannot be inebriated. You cannot be compromised by drugs, because you will not be able to actually just replicate. And that's very unique about behavioral biometrics, specifically the ones that we're talking about in here, where it's not just a cool technology, but your state of mind, right? You have to be thinking through, do I really want to authenticate? Yes, I want to authenticate. I want to log in, right? And the technology is such that it can tell if you're actually just stoned or drunk, and then you cannot use the equipment. That's a benefit beyond the technology, because that's a check that no other technology can do. And it can help you save, again, life and machine, if you will, life and limb, if you will. Imagine using that to actually do a pre-flight on a 787 Dreamliner. Imagine that use basically on a locomotive to turn on an engine for a train, right? So it's an example that is very practical. Even right now, imagine just turning on a Tesla. So imagine that what you're doing here is you're preventing a kid or somebody who is drunk from turning on the vehicle. So it's the same technology that you would use today by just signing in or just putting your thumbprint, but it's augmented by injecting the friction that you want, which is, am I sober enough to use this piece of equipment? So machinery, aviation, manufacturing, even in fintech, there's actually those elements where just because of what you're doing, you want to make sure that it basically just adds those factors of the authentication and perhaps those elements that are just go one step beyond the authentication as you were. So I just give you plenty of examples. If you want to see more examples, within the website, we have some case studies that can tell you how the technology can be used. And again, it's independent of our brand. I just want to be clear that there are other authentication devices and or technologies that are behavioral in nature, but that's the complexity that you bring in when you happen to use behavioral biometrics. You bring that favor. And from our perspective, again, we just happen to specialize on the signature form, the sign or the written form of the behavioral biometrics. So good question. And I want to make sure that I answered it. So was it a good answer for you, Andrew?
Yes, absolutely. And just another shameless plug for those that don't know, it's biosig-id.com. And under the Solutions tab, under CVL Tech, you can read about the applications, you can read about use cases. There's a lot of valuable information on the website.
Thank you. Appreciate it for the shameless plug. That's great. Okay, last minute alibis, last questions. I'm coming up here on 7 minutes until 45, and that's all the time that I had allotted for today. Any last questions? Well, excellent. You know, if there are no other questions or alibis, I do appreciate you actually joining me this afternoon. I hope that has been productive to at least, you know, make you think about alternatives to MFA and how signature passwords or drawn passwords can plug in some of the holes of MFA. I'll be sending you a link to the presentation so you can come and get it. You know, if you have any questions, you know, can feel free to email me at nelson.santini@biosig-id.com. I've been your host for today. Thank you so much for your time. And again, I hope to see you on the next webinar series. Thanks a lot for joining me today.